I don't even know if time of day or month or fucking year it is. Fucking bop around. Not cool. Mm-hmm.
Everyone has an opinion about Canadian federal politics.
Do you know anyone who loves Justin Trudeau? It's getting harder and harder to find anybody in Canada who does. That's because after 9 years, he's broken just about everything in our country. But you know what? It might be hard to find people in Canada who love Justin Trudeau. But
you're such a fucking bitch. Which you're gonna die. Come on.
So you can decide on what content from your blog, Google Doc, Word Doc, even at YouTube, depending on the plan you choose. For now, I'm going to use WordGenie, the AI feature. So what I need to do is give it an idea of what it can do. So tell WordGenie what it is. So from here now, it's saved as a draft, or I can choose the template. There are hundreds of templates to choose from, and you can totally customize or change anything, the images, the style, any of the text, whatever you want. So this one looks perfect for my niche, passion, grit, and success. All these images can be changed once you're in the editor, and I can set worksheets and all sorts within this template. So now you can see all my content from my draft being pulled into this template, and all the content's been laid out into single column, double column images in place. But of course, I can now customize and change anything. So if I don't like chapter page, perhaps that image doesn't work for me, I can search my inbuilt image search tool and just.
The more empathic you are, we see that it will burn you out if you are in a caring profession, if you are in a caring relationship, if you have friends, partners, spouses, you try to support them more and more, it will worsen your mental and lead to burnout, and in severe potential cases, even lead to vicarious trauma. So a lot of people nowadays are talking about how empathy is fantastic. We should have more empathy. We should have empathy for our friends, empathy for our work colleagues, empathy for our relationships, empathy for the whole world. And the more empathic we are, the more emotionally available we are, the better it will be. There'll be articles on this everywhere I look. So articles about this, and you'll even have people like this, like psychiatrists on the internet, who will talk about how being more empathic will benefit you and isn't even about helping other people. But it turns out that having empathy is incredibly dangerous. Having high levels of empathy is correlated with higher levels of burnout, leads to worsening mental health, actually allows people to objectively take advantage of you, and most bizarrely of all, can negatively impact your relationships, especially romantic relationships. We're going to start with this concept of emotional contagion. So this is really fascinating, but as people have gotten more interested in empathy over time, we basically discovered that there are multiple kinds of empathy. So one is something called cognitive empathy, which is the ability to understand what someone else thinks or believes. So it's sort of understanding what's in someone's head. And there's a second kind of empathy called affective empathy. And this is more in line with what people usually think of when we think of empathy. It's the ability to feel what someone else feels. But as researchers have looked into affective empathy especially, they've started to realize that there is a huge problem with this facet, is that it leads to something called emotional contagion. So what happens when you are very empathic with another person, when you have affective empathy, is they are feeling negative in some way. They're feeling sad, they're feeling depressed, they're feeling hopeless. And due to the empathic circuits of your brain, in order to form a connection with this person, you absorb some of their negativity. And literally in the scientific literature, this is called emotional contagion. And so what ends up happening when you are empathic with someone is you absorb some of their negativity and it actually negatively affects you. And this emotional contagion can lead to an incredible amount of burnout, because just because you're feeling what they're feeling, it doesn't necessarily help them feel better. Much like another kind of contagion, like an infection. When you get infected by someone else, it doesn't reduce the amount of infection that someone else feels. A lot of research on empathy shows that once this contagion happens, you basically suffer, and it doesn't necessarily lead to benefit in other people. So if we look at professions that involve a lot of empathy as part of their job, like people like social workers who are working with people who are struggling in their life, what we tend to find is that between 50 and 75% of social workers are actually burnt out. And one of the reasons that they're burnt out is because of all of the emotions that they're constantly dealing with. We see a lot of this in also something called caregiver burnout. These are not just professionals, but when you have someone who is taking care of someone else, so you have a family member or friend who is struggling a lot, and caregiver burnout was originally studied in things like cancer. So when you have a spouse who has cancer, you take care of them a lot, you're taking care of all the responsibilities, and that sort of leads to burnout. But we're seeing caregiver burnout also in mental health related issues with people like friends or romantic partners or even parents or children. This emotional contagion also has pretty specific manifestations, and a great example of this is something called vicarious trauma. We have studies that show that when you is an empath or someone who's supporting someone else continuously gets exposed to their trauma, you can exhibit symptoms of experiencing that trauma yourself. This is why we call it vicarious trauma. It's as if you were traumatized through simply having an empathic connection with someone who is traumatized. Now, this is an evolutionary thing that probably it helps us in some ways. So we know that, for example, parents experience this with children who are sick or injured in some way. In those kinds of situations, it's probably pretty helpful. But we know that vicarious trauma can also affect people like therapists. If they're not careful, they can actually suffer from the trauma of their patients. The really scary thing is that we are seeing this principle play out in an entirely new way because of the internet. So the internet has become a place where we really advocate for having a safe space to share and speak my truth and share the traumatic things that I've done. We'll see this a lot in mental health communities and discussions and on social media where people are sharing their trauma. And what's happened is really interesting. Even though we want the internet to be a place where you can share your trauma and want to accept you and help you heal and all that good stuff, on the flip side, we have people getting triggered by trauma dumping. And it's like, bruh, you're trauma dumping. I can't handle this right now. And I think what we've sort of figured out is in creating some of these safe spaces, we've gotten people who will essentially vomit their trauma, and then that negatively affects the audience, the person who's listening. And there's research to back this up. And I'm even seeing this in a very, very new way, which is almost trauma through repeated social media exposure. So it's almost like vicarious trauma that is experienced through social media. So if you look at social media, what you'll see is that there's a lot of really terrible stuff that we get exposed to. And the better of a person you are, the more likely you are to expose yourself to traumatic things, right? Because you care about these people, these refugees, these people who are starving, these people who are taken advantage of, victims of different kinds of violence and oppression. And we want to spread awareness, and we want to help people understand, and we want to share what's going on, these tragedies, because we as a world should do something about this. And so the kinder you are, the more empathic you are, the more that you expose yourself seeing something very scary, which is vicarious trauma through social media. And we're seeing evidence of this. The U.S. Surgeon General recently put out a kind of a beautiful op-ed where he was advocating for putting a warning on social media platforms for the dangers to mental health. So as you're empathic, it can actually lead to a social media-induced vicarious trauma that damages you and will worsen your mental health. This is all around how empathic you are. We see that it will burn you out if you are in a caring relationship. If you have friends, partners, spouses, you try to support them more and more, it will worsen your mental and lead to burnout, and in severe potential cases, even lead to vicarious trauma. So that's the first danger. But it gets better. So it's not just about absorbing the emotional contagion. The more empathic you are, the more likely you are to be advantage of. And if you're someone who's a highly sensitive person, if you're someone who's very empathic, you've already figured this out, that people take advantage of your kindness. They create these double standards where you understand the pain that they're going through when they get dumped. And so you're there for them, you're supporting them, but and you need support, they're so callous that they don't help you. They're like, I don't have time for this. They set limits with you, but are upset when you set limits with them. And if this is kind of the experience of a lot of people, what a lot of people will say is, oh, it's your fault, right? This is all in your head. You need to get better at setting boundaries. Things are way more even. This is the callous person that you're friends with will say, no, this is actually 50-50. You just don't realize it. So it turns out that there are studies, fascinating studies, that actually demonstrate very clearly that the more empathic you are, the more likely you are to be screwed in life. So I'm going to share one of these with you, okay? Super cool study. So in this study, it requires a couple of different things. So we have two people, okay? And we have, let's say, $100. And in this experiment, what we do is we give the $100 to one person. And we say to person number one, you have to divide this $100 into two groups. And then you have to offer one of these amounts to the other person. If the second person accepts the way that you split, both of you get to keep the money the way that you split it. So if I give you $100 and you decide, okay, like let's say it's me and you, okay? So let's say I have the $100, okay, and I'm going to split it with you. So I say, okay, I'm going to take $50 and you take $50. Do you accept? If you accept, you actually get the $50 and I get the $50. If you do not accept, neither of us gets money. That's the way that the experiment is designed, okay? So what we discover is that most people, if you have a relatively normal amount of empathy, will split things 50-50 because that's fair, right? I get $53, you get $53, it's all good. The second that you add a little bit of sociopathy into the mix, things start to change because here I'm a sociopath, right? And so I'm thinking to myself, well, this is like free money either way. So what I can do is I can say, how about 60-40? I get 60 and you get 40. If this person rejects it, they get nothing. And if they accept it, they at least get 40 free bucks and I get 60 free bucks. Even though it's not even, you are still benefiting. And I'm willing to give you an unfair trade, knowing that if you turn down my unfair trade, we both get screwed. So I'm going to take advantage of this fact by splitting up the money in an unfair way. And what we find is that people will even split things. If you're a real asshole, you'll split things 90-10. Okay, Dr. K, here's $100. I'm going to keep 90 and you take 10. If you want to turn it down, go ahead and turn it down. None of us gets anything. You're going to lose out on $10. And if you turn down the trade, I may lose out on 90, but you're going to lose out on 10. It's just free money. Just take the trade. I'll keep 90, you take 10, right? It's like win-win for both of us. So the more antisocial you are, the more likely you are to split things unfairly. Hey, y'all, if you're interested in applying some of the principles that we share to actually create change in your life, check out Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health. It combines over my experience of both being a monk and a psychiatrist. It distills all of the most important things I've learned into a choose your own adventure format. So check out the link in the bio and start your journey today. Now here's the crazy thing. The person's capacity to accept an unfair trade depends on their level of empathy. So the kinder you are, the more likely you are to accept an unfair trade in this scenario. So if I'm splitting things 50-50, unless you're a real asshole and you say, no, I'm not going to accept unless you give me take 10, right? You can kind of flip it around, but that's not the way the experiment is organized. So basically what happens is most people will sort of default to 50-50. And in order to accept an unfair trade, your empathy has to be high, right? And so what that basically means is that the more empathic you are, the more likely you are to take an uneven. Now, here's the really crazy thing, okay? The neurotransmitter serotonin is associated with empathy. The higher your serotonin is, the higher you are to be, the more likely you are to be empathic. As you are content and happy, you are more likely to be kind to other people. So they took this experiment, and then what they did is they gave people SSRI, anxiety medications that boost serotonin. So this is not just a general personality thing. They actually administered medication to these people. And what they found is when you give someone a serotonin boosting medication, they are more likely to accept unfair trades. The more empathic you are, the more likely to other people. This is wild. And if you're someone who is a person or incredibly empathic, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That your empathy allows other people to take advantage of you. But it gets even weirder. So the other really weird thing is if we look at histories of people who grew up abused, okay, they are more likely to be abusive. So if I was growing up where I was emotionally abused, when I grow up, I'm likely to abuse other people. And so we may think, okay, this is just a consequence of trauma, but it turns out that it's not just the trauma itself. It turns out that the more empathic you are, the more you understand your abuser. So as you put yourself in your abuser's shoes and then you sort of understand their perspective, there happen. The first is that you are likely to be forgiving of their abusive behavior, okay? So this is like literally what I've seen when I work as a psychiatrist and I work with people who are like in unfair or unhealthy or abusive relationships. What they always do is empathize with their abuser. So if someone is, let's say I'm in a romantic relationship where someone is physically abusive to me, what I'll do is I'll say like, oh, well, like I understand they're under so much stress right now. You know, they've been drinking a lot and that's their unhealthy coping mechanism. It's something that we're working on. You know, their life is hard. I understand why they would be like short. I understand why they would get angry. I understand that they grew up in a household where people were physically abusive to them. The more empathic I am with them, the more likely I am to be forgiving for their bad behavior, tolerant of their bad behavior. I empathize with my abuser. In the most severe called Stockholm Syndrome, which is pretty famous, someone gets kidnapped and is controlled, they start to have positive feelings towards their abuser. And it appears that this is all mediated by empathy. Now, it gets even weirder than that. It turns out that the more empathic you are, if you associate with people who are sociopaths, the more sociopathic you will become. There's a study that looks at this very specifically. So they took a group of people, gamers, and they had them play a video game. And in one video game, they play a character like Superman, and in another video game, they play a character like the Joker. So they play like literally, you can play as a good character or you can play as an evil character. So you play the game for a while and it's whatever, but then they did something really. After someone finished playing the game, they tested their capacity and they found that whichever character you play actually shapes the way that you then interact with the world. So they discovered a couple of things. The first is that if you played as the Joker, you are more likely to endorse violent solutions to problems. So when you play Superman and someone's like, is it okay to, hit someone in the face if they're fucking annoying you? And people who play Superman are like, nah, that's not okay. But if you play the Joker, people are more likely to say, yeah, violence is more justifiable and more of action that is acceptable. But it gets even weirder than that. It's even at the very, very minute level. So what they did is they took the people who played Superman, they took the people who played the Joker, and they asked them to look at neutral facial expressions. So it's just a facial expression that's neutral. And people who played Superman would look at this facial expression. They're angry or happy. They're not upset, thrilled. They're just chilling. They're vibing. They're neutral. But people who played as the Joker are more likely to interpret neutral facial expressions as being hostile or negative in some way. So when we sort of act out or empathize with some kind of abusive or negative figure that we perceive the world, and it changes the way that we believe justified or not justified. Absolutely wild, right? And this is not just one study I'm telling you guys about. This is like one study that has also been backed up by a lot of other studies. And then the third thing that they measured was how kind these people are after playing this video game. And what they sort of discovered is they would ask people like, how much money would you donate to a good cause? People who play Superman are more likely to donate to a good cause. The Joker are less likely to donate or would donate a smaller amount. So it appears that being empathic towards an evil figure in some way actually literally changes the way that we perceive the world, changes what we think is justifiable or acceptable, and literally alters. The last thing that we're going to talk about is super wild, because a lot of people think that empathy is a net positive for a relationship, including this guy. But it turns out that empathy can actually be damaging for a relationship. And once I explain this to you, I hope it makes sense, because once I understood it, it clicked for me so beautifully. So let's say you're early on in a relationship. You're not really committed to each other yet. Y'all have been talking a little bit. You've gone on maybe 2 dates. Now let's say you're highly empathic, okay? And so early on in a relationship, y'all are not deeply in love. Y'all are kind of like, I don't know if I like this. I don't know if I don't like this. Like, this person is good in this ways. These are a couple of green flags. These are a couple of red flags. And so the more empathic you are, the more sensitive and accurate you are at judging your partner's unhappiness. And let's think about what that would do. If I've gone on 2 dates with you and I recognize that you are unhappy with these qualities, you don't like me for these reasons, maybe you find someone else attractive, and there's studies that show that people who are highly empathic early on in relationships accurately judge when their partner is attracted to someone else. Okay? So someone's like, hey, do you think that girl is pretty? Do you think she's pretty? And I'm like, no, I don't think she's pretty. But if you're highly empathic, you know that I'm bullshitting. You can read what I'm sort of really experiencing. You feel that empathy because your empathy circuits are strong. You're a mind reader, and you actually recognize that I do think that chick is attractive. So what impact do you think this has on relationships? Studies actually show that a high level of empathy early on in relationships can actually sabotage the relationship and prevent it from progressing, because you are accurately able to detect someone else's unhappiness. And remember, because of the principle of emotional contagion, when you detect that unhappiness, you also feel that unhappiness. So what that means is that if your partner is unhappy, you are able to accurately read that and you become unhappy. So let's take 2 scenarios. One where one partner is slightly unhappy and you're actually having a great time. The second person's like totally chilling, totally vibing. We're enjoying this. It's 2 dates in. Let's see where it goes. If they are not empathic, and there's a term called mind blindness, if they are more mind blind, they are oblivious to their partner's dissatisfaction, which means that their partner can kind of like work themselves through it, right? Just because I'm attracted to someone or just because I'm unhappy with something doesn't mean I'm going to break up with someone. I may need to work through it myself. I may need to let go of my ex. I may need to go to therapy myself or work on my confidence or whatever. So in one situation, you have one unhappy person and one happy person. And it turns out that if you have one happy person and one unhappy person in a relationship, that relationship is more likely to succeed than if you have one unhappy person, emotional contagion, and then a second unhappy person. Which relationship do you think is more likely to succeed? One with an unhappy and one happy person where they can maybe work through things, or a relationship where both people are unhappy? So it turns out that we have studies that show that having a high level of empathy actually sabotages your early relationships. And I see this so much in my clinical practice when I work with people who are very caring, very empathic, and even are kind of like this nice guy picture. There's other stuff that involves nice guys, but let's say an empathic, emotionally available dude. So it turns out that empathic, emotionally available dudes will be like, oh my God, nice guys finish last. They have this consistent experience of getting into relationships, being incredibly caring, and for some reason they end up alone. And then they say, like, I don't understand. I'm such a nice person. I'm emotionally available. I'm empathic. I'm caring. I've gone to therapy, and yet I'm alone. And then what does the internet do? The internet victim blames, right? No, you're a nice guy. You're one of these toxic nice people who's looking for sex and you're not actually kind and you're this and you're this and you're this. There's no victim blaming unless you're a nice man on the internet, right? And that's the one situation where it's okay to victim blame. So we sort of have these scenarios, and I've seen this not just in men, but women as well, who are incredibly empathic and supportive and wind up alone. And it turns out that there are a couple of good reasons for that. The first is that as they are empathic, they experience emotional contagion, and their partner's unhappiness becomes their unhappiness. Instead of being stable and resilient and helping your partner move from unhappiness to happiness, you get contaminated by it and it sabotages the relationship. But there are also other factors as well. People who are empathic, as we mentioned, are more likely to be taken advantage of. People are going to take advantage of your kindness. If you are a nice guy, you know what I'm talking about, because people will take advantage of your kindness. There is this whole complex of sometimes men are deceptive, right? Where they are expecting sex, but they're offering kindness, and that's kind of like an act. But the opposite is also true, where people are genuinely kind and get genuinely taken advantage of. And there's data to support that as well. And so it turns out that recognizing threats early on in a relationship is a double-edged sword. Because the more that you see problems in the relationship, the more likely you are to mentally check out. Whereas recognizing threats later in the relationship seems to correlate with positive, relationship lifespan and satisfaction. So, and this may sound kind of confusing, right? Because there are people on the internet who will talk about how you should be more empathic. And you may be wondering, okay, well, some people say you should be more empathic and some people you say you should be less empathic. Which one is it? And it turns out that empathy, just like any other human function, whether we look at confidence, ego, narcissism, fear, anxiety, happiness, love, all of these things are neither good nor bad. It is who is in control of them. Does the love control you? Oh, love is such a wonderful thing, except when you fall in love with the wrong person. Oh my God, anxiety is such a terrible thing, except when anxiety warns you of danger and actually helps you survive and protect yourself. Now the question kind of becomes, all right, Dr. K, you said that we should be less empathic, but what do I do about this? How do I be less empathic? Should I just be more of an asshole? And it turns out that there are a variety of different things that correlate with sort of protecting yourself from too much empathy. And as we learn these skills, we will have a healthier relationship with our empathy. The first thing that we need to do is be more compassionate instead of empathic. When we help someone, there are two different modes of operation. And it turns out that compassion is, like, neuroscientifically somewhat discrete from empathy. So remember, affective empathy is the ability to feel what someone else is feeling, whereas compassion is the ability to have kindness towards someone else. And often those two things come hand in hand, right? I feel your pain, therefore I'm kind. But you don't have to feel someone's pain to be kind to them. So when, like if you have a little kid, let's say like a 6-year-old kid who loses their favorite stuffed animal, or their blanket gets, ruined in the wash, even though I don't really understand that pain unless it happened to me, I can still be compassionate and kind towards them. What we sort of discover, especially if you're a psychiatrist or therapist, is that you can have compassion towards your patients without being caught up in their emotions. And this is where I think a key thing to understand is recognize that you don't have to feel what you feel in order to be kind. You let them stay over there, and you can exhibit kindness towards them without becoming one with them. The problem with empathy is that it causes two of us to fuse. So very practically, I think the best way to sort of implement this, for people that you want to help, be responsible for helping them. Don't be responsible for their problems. So when you make their problems your problems, when you get overly invested, let's find you a girlfriend, let's find you a boyfriend, let's find you love. I'm going to work night and day to find you love. That's a recipe for disaster, because you can't find them love. You can't control their behavior, but you're trying to achieve a particular thing in their life. It actually has a paradoxical effect where the more invested you become, the more it damages you and the more lazy they become. As you take responsibility for the outcome, they stop taking responsibility for the outcome. And a pattern that I've seen in my practice over and over and over again is that the more empathic that you are, the more people rely on you and become like basically fucking lazy, right? And I see this a lot even with like parents that I work with who have children who are addicted to video games. As mom does more and more and more to help their child, does their laundry, cooks for them, let me help you with your resume, let me help you with this college application. Did you do your college application? The child becomes more and more incompetent. And what you will find, especially if you see all these, like I see a lot of posts about things like weaponized incompetence, is what you will see is for anyone to have weaponized incompetence. And if you're an empathic person who deals with weaponized incompetence, there is someone who facilitates or enables that weaponized incompetence. That human being has to be able to be that incompetent for a reason. Otherwise, they would be more capable, right? Someone had to do everything for them. So separate compassion from empathy. The second thing that we need to understand is that the more self-critical you are, the more vulnerable you are to high levels of empathy. So there are studies that show that you can be empathic, but if you have confidence in yourself, that sort of maintains a certain amount of stability in your identity. So if I'm confident and I'm empathic, that kind of works out okay. But if I'm self-critical, if I blame myself and I'm empathic, that is like a terrible cocktail that will wreck your mental. So let's like think through this for a second so we understand, right? So let's say I feel your pain and then I'm self-critical. So now that I feel bad, when my emotional circuits activate, it also triggers my self-critical sort of like rumination and this kind of stuff, right? After you go through a breakup or when you get exposed to something sad, these self-critical thoughts will start flooding your mind. And it turns out that if you get that empathic signal from the outside, it still triggers this self-critical reaction. So if your friend is going through a breakup and they're really struggling and they're really sad, you can even blame yourself. I should be a better friend. Or they're asking for your help and you feel burnt out and then you feel guilty. We'll get to that one in a second because that's a whole other thing. But it turns out that the more self-critical you are, the more vulnerable to empathy you will be. So the solution there is to focus on your own confidence. It isn't even about setting limits with other people or cutting yourself off, which is oftentimes the coping mechanism that we end up using. As you reduce your own self-critical thinking and develop confidence, you will be able to handle empathy better. Now let's get to the third thing. It's super cool. So it turns out that the other thing that makes people vulnerable to high levels of empathy is internal conflict. So if you're someone who's highly empathic, hopefully this makes sense too, that you feel for someone's pain and then you want to help them, but you recognize that there's emotional contagion. You recognize that you have your own stuff to deal with. You don't have the bandwidth to help them right now. And so then you're conflicted because if you set boundaries with them, you feel guilty. And if you don't set boundaries with them, you're sacrificing your own stuff. So highly empathic people oftentimes are put into lose-lose situations by themselves. You feel like it's someone else putting you in that situation, but it's actually your internal conflict that worsens the negative impacts of empathy. And so what we want to do there is recognize anytime you are kind to someone else or you're trying to be empathic towards someone else, right? Anytime you're trying to be supportive, notice if there is an internal conflict. And recognize that the worse that internal conflict is, the more of a lose-lose situation you're going to be in. So how do you resolve that? And this is like literally what we do in therapy, right? So I had a patient once who their parents wanted them to come home for the holidays. Lots of patients, not just one. The patient doesn't like to come home for the holidays because mom and dad are divorced. They live in the same city. And no matter whether you go home for the holidays or don't go home for the holidays, mom or dad is not going to be happy. It's a very ugly divorce. Mom is unhappy that you're only spending Christmas morning with her. Dad is unhappy that mom gets Christmas morning and they get Christmas afternoon. And so these two people got divorced for a reason, right? They're really unhappy and they're somewhat self-absorbed. And there's no way that my patient can win. They hate going back because no matter what they do, they cannot make both of their parents happy. Because what both of their parents want is a full Christmas with the child that they love. And even if my patient says, okay, this year we're going to do you, what that means is that the other parent gets no child for this year of Christmas. So they never hear the end of it. So they would try to set limits and they would feel incredibly guilty. And then they would not set limits and they would feel torn apart. So literally in psychotherapy, what we do with this person is work through that internal conflict. Right? Stop taking responsibility for your parents' happiness. I know this sounds crazy, but they signed up for only half of a Christmas the moment they got divorced. Do you get that? Like, this is something of their making. They're the fucking ones who decided to get divorced, and somehow this is your problem to solve. Now you're supposed to duplicate yourself and be in two places at once. You're supposed to make up for the decision that your parents divorced themselves. This is what we do in psychotherapy. It's about resolving that internal conflict. And when we realize that, when we have that breakthrough, and he's like, oh, whoa, hold on a second. This is not my problem. I no longer have to feel guilty. I'm going to show up at Christmas morning with my mom, show up at Christmas morning with my dad, and then I'm also going to have a conversation with them and be like, hey, both of y'all, let's hop on a conference call. Both of y'all want me to be there for Christmas. If y'all wanted me to be there for Christmas the whole time, and both of you wanted me 100%, the thing that y'all should have done is never gotten divorced. Now y'all are in two places. I cannot be in two places at once. Y'all tell me what you want to do. Y'all figure it out. Stop putting me in the middle. It is the resolution of that internal conflict, the absolution of that guilt that then protects you from that empathy and stops getting you screwed. It's such a simple solution. It's such a simple realization that you as a child don't control this. This is their problem. And yet the more empathic we are, the more we adopt their point of view, because their parents are mad at each other. So I'm going to accept their framing of the problem. So this is something that y'all have to be incredibly careful about, that everyone is talking about the benefits of empathy and how we should be more empathic. And all I'm looking for is someone who is very empathic and supports me and loves me. And you know, if they can't handle me at my worst, they don't deserve me at my best. And since I'm entitled to them handling me at my worst, I'm going to just be my worst all the time, right? Because that's their fucking problem now. And there you are accepting it. You're like, yeah, I want to be a good boyfriend. I want to be a good girlfriend. I should be emotionally available. I should be empathic. I should be supportive. Because if I'm not, I feel guilty. And then that tears me up inside. And I don't want to feel guilty because that makes me a bad person. So I'm going to help them. And I'm not going to set boundaries with them. And I'm going to let them walk all over me. Doesn't work. So be very careful about empathy. Recognize that it can damage everything from your relationships to your self-esteem to having you even experience vicarious trauma. And learn to set some of these limits, otherwise you will go absolutely insane. And then everyone around you who cares about you can go insane with you.
Hypoallergenic.
Vladimir Putin is calling Ukraine's bluff by saying they have been willing to go to peace talks all along. And in fact, the evidence supports that. We've been covering that for 2.5 years. We are tired of saying that Russia is willing to cease fire. Ukraine is doing political theater and refusing, and people are dying all along. Now, we reported in June that Zelensky, because he was so threatened by the war in Israel, decided to host a peace summit in Switzerland, saying we're going to come up with a peace idea to stop the war with Russia, but Russia was never invited. So that's not how you negotiate with somebody, by having them not come. That would kind of be negotiation 101, you would think. But they invited President Biden, and President Biden, also tiring of this war, realizing it does not help his popularity, didn't go to the peace summit in June in Switzerland. Instead, he went to the fundraiser with George Clooney and Julia Roberts. In hindsight, that was a bad idea, because George Clooney, right, yeah. This was the headline, like, no, I'm busy. I got A-list celebrities. George Clooney turned around and turned turncoat on him, so maybe he should have gone to the BSP summit in Switzerland. In that same summit, China also said they were not going to go. They said that they would not participate in any peace deals unless 3 important elements were met, namely the recognition of the events by both Moscow and Kiev. So if Russia's not invited, we're not going to go, because we're not going to come up with a unilateral idea. What is the point? India, same story, also RSVP no, for exactly the same reasons. So now Zelensky's saying, okay, I'm going to have a new peace summit, guys. You're going to come to this. It's later in November. We are going to negotiate peace, and this time we will invite Russia. Now, this is the first time Zelensky has said that he would involve Russia in any decisions. You recall that he created a law that made it so that he could not even attend peace talks with Russia. So how he's going to break his own law? He has no problems breaking laws in Ukraine. We know this. So here's what he said to last week at the NATO summit, saying, I set a goal that in November we'd have a fully ready plan. I think that representatives of Russia should be at the second summit. So that is major progress, recognizing that Russia needs to be part of a deal with Russia. He's a little slow. He says, it's time for that. Now, Matthew Miller, the State Department spokesperson, said, we've always supported diplomacy when Ukraine is ready. bullshit, and it's never been clear that the Kremlin is ready for diplomacy. That's a lie.
That's a total
Right
lie.
there. He's just
Bald-faced lie.
bald-faced lie. Yeah, you want to expand on that?
Well, I mean, look, from the very beginning, even before this happened, even before in December, we know that this was the case, that there was peace agreements on the table ready to be employed, and sort of pleading with them, like, go forward with this peace agreement. Then, of course, we know about in Turkey, right? In Ankara, there was peace negotiations happening until
The West sabotage.
until the West, specifically Boris Johnson, flew in with his floppy hair and sabotaged the peace agreements, where Zelensky had basically signed the agreement.
Mhm.
And, by the way, they would have had more land. They would have kept huge swaths of land as part of the agreement.
Yes.
But they didn't, and the West scuttled that agreement.
All right, we're going to look at the land in just a second. But now at least Russian spokesman Dmitry Peskov agreed, yes, Russia should be there, but we're not falling for any more of your non-peace peace plans like the Switzerland was. According to Peskov, he says, by no means a peace summit is what Zelensky has been posting. So it's probably necessary to first understand what he means. So you don't want to just keep having meetings if the guy's showing up with no plan at all, which is no peace plan. Now, what he means by this, Zelensky's peace plans have been non-starters, and it's the same. He's been repeating this for the last 18 months, and we've been over this many times, but we'll do it again because the mainstream media does not understand the land conflict that is in eastern Ukraine. They never show these maps, but we do. What his Zelensky's plan is, and have NATO weapons and NATO soldiers and give back Crimea and the Donbass, the area that it is currently defending. So let's look at that. If you take a look at this map, what you see in the red here is the area that was Ukraine when the conflict started in early 2022 and is now a part of Russia. The areas there that are shaded to become Russia, they have Russian IDs, Russian passports, they're Russian speakers. Those mayors asked Russia to come in and protect them from repeated attacks by Ukraine, which started in 2014. Now, the gray area between the light area that's Ukraine and the red area that's now Russia, the gray area is still the area that's under contention. And in fact, the people who live in those regions, majority want to join Russia, and Russia has said that is the territory they are going to stop at.
But not only wanted to become part of Russia, voted overwhelmingly as
Yes.
part of the referendum to become part of Russia when they were put to a vote. I think the vote was over 93 or 94%.
The lowest percentage was only in one region of the Donbass, was in the high 80s, 86%, I believe it was. The other regions were all in the 90% that wanted to become a part of Russia because they are ethnic Russians and they speak Russian, and their schools are in Russian, and they've been tortured by the SBU since 2014.
And the Biden administration, under the leadership of Jake Sullivan, the State Department, and others have said that that election was a total fake election, and you can't trust those election results. That's really rich.
Yeah, that's easy for them to say.
Really rich.
Now, Ukraine cannot retake. Can we put the map back up? Just because I didn't get to my point, I apologize. Ukraine cannot take back that red area. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the wherewithal, and they don't have the money. But even if they could, even if by some miracle Russia agreed to withdraw from those areas, Ukraine has given no assurances that the people who were tortured there for the last decade will be safe. They have never said that. And, despite us listening for it. So again, also Zelensky's plan is to retake Crimea, which is the island at the bottom that you see there. That became part of Russia in 2014, also by an overwhelming vote, because again, Ukraine was attacking them, attacking their own people. Now, when Russia proposed keeping the borders as is and a ceasefire, Ukraine has just ignored that and said, nope, we're taking that back, even though there's no real logistical way they can do that. But they also Russia wants Ukraine to end all NATO negotiations, especially because last week NATO declared unequivocally that all NATO members are now nuclear members. This was the declaration from the NATO summit last week in Washington, D.C., saying as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. Again, Russia doesn't want nukes on its borders any more than the United States wants nukes on its borders. Nobody should want nukes anywhere near their family. raise your hand if you agree. So now this is a matter of timing, whether Russia goes to the event, which they have always said they would if it's a serious proposal. But a question now is, what U.S. representatives would go to this peace talk? Who would be interested in it? President Biden, I would say the wind is out of his sails for supporting Ukraine. He says it at NATO summits. He says it, Senate meetings and such like that. He definitely opens the checkbook, but it is not a hot campaign topic for him. You can see that when he says that, it gives him no political favors, no points. But would he even go? Or if by November, when this summit happens, we have President-elect Donald Trump, then would anyone from the Trump campaign go? Well, not if the new VP candidate J.D. Vance has anything to say about it. In December of 2023, he told Steve Bannon that people in Washington want to cut Social Security benefits to give money to Ukraine so Zelensky's ministers can buy yachts, and he's offended by it. Watch.
You have a foreign leader coming to the United States like we're some sort of geopolitical Salvation Army. That is not the role of the United States here, is to hand out money to every beggar who comes into our country and demands that we fund their foreign conflict. So Zelensky is parachuting into this domestic political debate about prioritizing our own border. He's not here to tell us anything we haven't heard before. He's here to badger Speaker Johnson and Senate Republicans into foregoing our on border security in order to write another blank check. I've never seen anything like this. This is not Churchill coming in the midst of World War II. This is literally a guy waiting for a handout and telling Republicans to stop negotiating over your own border security. I'm offended by it. As a United States Senator, I'm offended by it. We focus on our own border and be having that debate. We don't need Zelensky to parachute and tell us how to run our country. You have people in this town saying we need to cut Social Security. There are people who cut Social Security, throw our grandparents into poverty. Why? So that one of Zelensky's ministers can buy a bigger yacht. Kiss my ass, Steve. It's not happening.
With this crayon, whatever I draw comes to life.
Hold on a second. Don't you have to go to school?
Block? Who's that block?
You can't spend a day in a barrel.
What does it say? They saw him making things in there.
Now breaking a few rules.
Do this. I actually want to know.
Just really like that person.
Are you getting the most value out of your hiring software? Companies that use Greenhouse see a 589% return on their investment, with a payback on that initial investment in just 7 months. Maximize your ROI. Your hire decisions faster all together in Greenhouse.
Okay. Clyde in our chat says he's got that one right. I agree. Now, he said some things about creating a new war with Iran that I'm not thrilled about, but at least on this one, J.D. Vance.
Yeah, I mean, people say in the chat, you guys should do it. So we certainly have. We mentioned quite a bit yesterday on the show, and there's a lot of things that I don't agree with him on. But we talked about that yesterday, so we definitely did.
We did, yes, but at least we have someone now who is a leader of a party saying no more for Ukraine, no more supporting them when we have.
And I like
I'm
what
with you
Tucker.
on that. I'm glad to hear that.
I like what Tucker said about that, which is look at the people. When you look at J.D. Vance, regardless of maybe how you feel about him, look at all the people who came out in opposition to him. People like Lindsey Graham and others, warmongers, war pigs, who absolutely want us to continue in Ukraine and sending money into Israel and other spots. And J.D. Vance on Israel right now, I don't fully know where he stands on sending more money and weapons to on the Ukraine part of it. At least he is absolutely against it. So
Yes.
that absolutely rubs those individuals the wrong way, to Tucker's point. But again,
Right.
we'll have to see. Proof is in the pudding.
But if there is a Trump party in power, or at least a president-elect in power, and they say we're not going to go to your peace summit, Ukraine, you got to put on your big boy pants and work this out on your own. That does what we have said all along, gives Russia the bargaining chip to end the war in the way that they wanted to, and that's what every pundit we've had on this show has said all along. So it's just putting Ukraine in a worse and worse and worse position. Zelensky doesn't care. He's a demon. but the people who have to die between now and then is a real tragedy.
I know that like we get confused in the U.S. that we're not actually part of every conflict on Earth. We don't need to be here for peace negotiations. You've got two countries that are in conflict with each other can't negotiate it out by themselves without.
It is quite possible.
Why? Fuck. No. Fucking creep.
I go to Stanford University. I have a 10-inch and before.
You also recorded some videos. We see now the suspect's van was parked right in your street, and they all kind of had it closed off, Martha, because they didn't want people from the rally to park on your street. So then you knew this guy's car wasn't supposed to be there. Walk me through what you saw.
So I came home a little bit before 5, saw it parked there. Didn't really think too much of it. It was the only spot in the whole yard or the whole road that wasn't blocked off. So later on in the night, everything happened, and we got home, and we were sitting there, saw cops all lined on the street. So whenever we looked out, we walked outside and saw them opening up his vehicle and everything. When the cop opened it, everybody else jumped back and was trying to stay out of the way. Here I am worried about it blowing up or whatever's going on. So
To find out that this happened, former president could nearly right in the head, almost made it across the street from your house, and then to find out that the gunman's car was possibly parked right in front of your house. How many cops are we talking about that were out there surrounding this van? And was there a license plate on the back of that van?
there's probably 5 to 10 cars out there, and there was an Arizona plate on the van, and there was cops all together, all outside of the van, and then, like I said, whenever the one opened up the door, the rest of them all jumped back trying to stay out of the way.
Mike, did you ever have any comments with your classes in high school?
No, I didn't have any classes with him. I had my own interactions with him. Just seeing him in school. Insane. This is where I did it. I never thought this would be going in the town that I grew up in my whole life. Well, I was actually at Bethel Sheets last night. Bethel Park Sheets, one right down the road. And we just, like, people were coming in, and we just heard it, like, people were talking about it, like, yo, this kid's from Bethel. And we just, that's how we all learned. And then we started seeing pictures online, and we were like, wow, this is insane.
Kind of stood out as a bit of a loner. Was that ever anything that might have been worrying to you or might have rang any alarm bells?
I mean, yeah, but that's not something you want to think about. You don't want to have that sort of thought in your head, like, he's a little off. Is he going to do something? You know?
This course offers hands-on learning with tools such as ChatGPT and OpenAI API to teach the basics of generative AI. It's designed for beginners, making it accessible to all interested in AI and ML. By the end of this course, you will grasp generative AI fundamentals and its real-world possibilities. For more details, check out this course link today.
survived an assassin's bullet. And now we're getting stunning new details about the security failures that allowed them to get a clear shot at the former president. Fox is confirming that local police reported a suspicious man using a rangefinder 30 minutes before that local officer even took a picture of him. And we're also, of course, seeing more of those videos of the crowds that spotted the gunman at least 1 minute and 26 seconds before he opened fire. Yet, that assassin was still able to fire 8 rounds, just 130 yards from former President Donald Trump.
About a minute and a half of people screaming, warning law enforcement that someone's on the roof with it before anyone did anything. Take a look.
Yeah, it's laying down.
So there you go. You can see people warning law enforcement. Fox again confirmed the FBI has interviewed more than 100 people, including the local law enforcement officer that saw Thomas Crooks armed on the roof, then retreated away from the scene. Harris, this morning, FBI agents were back on the scene looking at the AJR building where Crooks fired his to police. We previously reported that local law enforcement was in charge of securing that building, even staging in and around the building, but still missed him on the roof. They were inside the building. He was on the roof. We've confirmed a local police officer reported to Pennsylvania State Police there was a suspicious man at the Trump rally with what appeared to be a rangefinder, possibly binoculars, before the rally began. People reported to police on scene this suspicious person was near magnetometers, pacing around, asking questions, looking suspicious. Sources say that man turned out to be Crooks, who later the president father, Corey Compatore, injuring 2 others. Sources tell Fox this AGR building was outside the perimeter and again was the responsibility of the locals. Still, the Secret Service is under increasing pressure to explain how this could have happened.
It's our country. It's a disaster. We have to do something. We don't have anything that ties us together. When that day comes, and you know what I mean when the economic crisis comes, because it's coming. Like, what's that going to look like? It's going to be very scary. There's a net benefit to them in destroying this country. Our public obsessions are getting increasingly irrelevant. Actually, increasingly like crazy. I understand that people go to the people that cheated on the election. They go to the people that are looking at the people that cheated on the elections. They do it right. It's a disgrace what's going on with our country. The radicalism. Democrats rigged the presidential election in 2020, and we're not going to allow them to rig the presidential election.
Jane's husband left her with their two sons, Jamie and Michael. Jane told herself that she would dedicate her life to her son. In return, they would take care of her. I will take care of you, she thought. In return, they can never leave. Looking at her, Jane is imposing an obligation on herself. She is binding them to a comfort. Their children, they're not in a position to consent to such a contract. So how does this play out? Jane will do anything for them, as long as they do. But as they start growing up, naturally, they start wanting to live their own lives. They want to spend time with their friends and lovers. And anytime they want to be present, anytime they want to do something without them, anytime they want to feel creative and distance, their mom uses guilt and obligation to make them stay. She says, after all the time, energy, money, and commitment, you're just going to leave me a terrible son. What is this fair of Jane to do? She pulls this contract on her kid. I would take care of you as long as you never leave. When they were not in a position to consent to such a contract, and whenever they seem to threaten her contract, she uses guilt and obligation to force them to comply again. Instead of handling the problem with openness, mature, and healthy way, she emotionally blackmails their son and rescues them. Now let's look at the second weapon someone uses to convict you. Here, the person who blamed the victim claims that they did not kick the legitimate consent when they actually did. They're trying to claim they didn't kick legitimate consent so that others will feel pity for them and disgust for you. People who feel pity for them on their side increase the chance that someone will contact you. If people feel disgust for you, the person who blamed the victim turns people against you, which will increase the chances that they switch their demands. Let's return to our example. So Jane's attempt to use guilt and obligation works for one of her sons, Jamie. Michael tells his mom that he will be away to go to a good close home. So what does Jane do when guilt and obligation fail? She uses pity and disgust. She says to Jamie, the son who feels obligated to her, can you believe Michael do this for someone? He took all of my money and then left me all alone. She makes Jamie feel pity towards him, increasing the chances he'll rescue her. It makes him feel disgust towards his brother Michael, increasing the chances Jamie will abandon Michael or coerce him into submitting to his mother's demands. But is it fair for Jamie to believe that Michael took all of the money and left? Remember, Jane's contract, I will take care of you as long as you never leave. Jane was an adult when she chose to enter that contract with Michael, but Michael was just a baby. Jane was capable of giving legitimate consent, and she did, but she expected mutual consent from Michael that he wasn't in a position to give at the time. And even if Michael was able to give consent, he might not have wanted to enter into that contract with his mother. One where she supports him in exchange for never leaving her home. So she gave legitimate consent to receive the person who wanted as a child. But now that he's not meeting her demands, he's trying to claim she never gave him consent
sharing some ideas about critical capability is join us and subscribe to us. Make sure you do that so that we can continue to be updated. Additionally, coming up in less than a week, is the storms. This is going to be a webinar doing eventually white people looking at predicting what is going to happen next. Part of it is that I similar to your analysis, there is variants of it. And the question is how will it benefit? And that's what I'm trying to analyze. What are the possibilities? So that's coming up if you're interested in next month. So let's get back to this question about important paper that has come up recently. And you have to know that this paper, as I said, came out and the date was published on March 6th. And essentially what they were looking at is the direct effect of the vaccine, the current vaccine, on the various pathogens, which could explain menstrual irregularity. So we have to take it back to where this is from. This is why I think we have the line of the responsibility of regulators because you may not have remembered this. I will take you back to why. This is where this was an article produced by News looking at the fact that this is in June 2021. And I'm going to try and make this bigger so that you can see it. And so in June 2021, there was a claim that the COVID vaccines could make the cycle the toxic and spread to other parts of the body and damage organs. And there was a radio interview area of Bridal. And it was used, they said, it's being social media used as opposed to vaccines. So in that radio interview, he was concerned, he said he was pro-vaccine, but goes on to discuss a fringe theory that is high protein produced from vaccine is toxic and can damage certain organs. He was making specific reference to those studies study from mice. And though Bridal uses social media for indications that's involved in developing the vaccines, the spike protein is energetic, it produces an immune response, but it is not a toxin. So another researcher was countering. And in effect, they went on, this was a Dr. Paul, an infectious disease expert, who went on to say that this was not relevant. He shared online a writer's interview with the alternative vaccine that they was in the body. Now, you can see where this was going. This was misinformation. He didn't say the job at the time, but it was labeled as misinformation. You couldn't talk about it because it was used vaccine hesitancy. And this was what happened at the time. But you have to remember that something else was also going on. Because at that time, women were complaining about menstrual irregularity. This can happen to some specifically hepatitis vaccine and the HPV vaccine can sometimes cause menstrual irregularity. This was on a very significant scale, so much so that it was studied, and this was a paper from Saudi Arabia looking at COVID vaccination and menstrual disorders in women. And a meta-analysis, what it means is that it involved in studies. So there were lots of people looking at this. Now, you can see from this here that when they looked at results in terms of malaria, this was 24%. Gonorrhea was 16%. And when they looked at abnormal cycle length, it was only 6.6%. And polygonorrhea was only 2%. This was significant This was what was going on, and there was not a thorough view as to what exactly was happening. So let me remind you in case you're not when we look at the heart That's my so let's just take a little bit of the physiology of what's happening with the table. So let's just take things back to the basics. This here is areas you can see here. This is our uterus. The ovaries are here on both sides, and then you have the connecting it down here in the vagina. Normally, a cell on the ovary but a fertilized an egg that could be fertilized will go down to the inside, and if there was an opportunity for it to fertilize then instead in the uterus here, that's the opportunity of pregnancy. And you have inside the ovary, so this is not the ovary, you have the primordial follicles on the outside, and the primary follicles, one is not yet active or active, that's from the cortex. And then you have the more active here, secondary follicles, and the secondary follicles will aim to one activated follicle, which will then use the egg, which then goes along and it goes fertilization. That's what happens. That's the sequence that the body goes through each month. And it's a very, very complex and delicate procedure. And this is what it would look like from a physiological point of view. You can see here that this is the cycle, menstrual period where someone bleeding. Now you can see the hormone levels here, follicle activity, green, here it's red, estrogen levels, and progesterone. rises quite significantly, goes down, and you have the decline. All of this is in preparation in case that data gets fertilized. And if it doesn't get fertilized, that's when you have shedding of the vitamin because it goes through the same process again. This is what you look right here. And again, you can see the menstrual part here, the represents the bleeding. The lining versus withdrawal starts again in the follicular phase. It starts to gradually increase the amount of which occurs here. Continuously increases the progesterone. The egg doesn't get fertilized. Progesterone is not being low. And then you go back to shedding, and this is again 28-day cycle. The importance of this is that it is such a remarkable system. It is really well integrated, and I'm showing you again the hormonal changes. You can see how all four of these integrate to ensure that you have ovulation in the middle of this. Without this occurring, the other bit doesn't even matter. So there's a very complex interrelationship between hormones, estrogen, FSH, LH, progesterone, all working together in the context of this menstrual cycle. This is why I thought that the observation of the menstrual changes are so important. The menstrual cycle is probably the most sensitive physiological change that we can observe. Nothing else is as sensitive as the menstrual cycle. So if that would be happening with the menstrual cycle, changes, would it be happening to other organs as well? Because we are not aware of subtle changes, we have no idea as to the implications of it. So let's get back to the paper here. Actually, before I get back to the paper, I wanted to mention something. In 2021, they were making all the points of raise and safety. The CDC was aware that there was a precedent. And you'll notice here, the VSD menstrual irregularities were approved. At this point, this is January 27th, 2023. They were getting the reports. The reports are increasing, especially on social media platforms that actually have respect for the system. So they have realized that, you know what, we better investigate this. So the investigation only started in January. And at that point, they're still recommending vaccines to low-risk female cohort who are in the prime where they have the ability to have the benefit of the cycle. That is concerning because I think that if they were concerned about it, you have a low-risk cohort, why would you mandate that? This is the kind of question that we will still have to come back to legally if there are long-term issues they better hope that it goes away. I highlighted a few things here about the eggs, and they're in yellow here, as I said. This was a good paper. It's out of this well detailed look, and again, they mentioning that women worldwide reported short irregularities. And so they were looking at it. One of the first things that we see here, clinical examination of the vaccine polymerase molecule indicates its accumulation in the ovaries. So they knew this, and this was the point that Professor Wright was making, was the class that received this information. What they found was that one of the hormones involved was upregulated, while anti-uterine hormone was downregulated. And then when they looked at the post-vaccination blood levels, they noticed actually a threefold change in the post-vaccination period in the FSH and the level of protein maturation. Inhibit B to inhibit the follicle stimulating the level of the activity journeys of the brain. So the levels and the ratio is likely to be very important with regards to how that cycle actually works together. So, really important information. The final point they made here in the abstract that I'll mention here is that the altered expression of NFP could significantly impact this vaccinated women and may ultimately influence their endometrial cycle, manifesting clinically by the couple of changes in menstrual patterns. One of the problems is that they are still looking at this in a relatively short period of time, and the longer-term implications are not yet fully known. So I want to highlight an important part of this in terms of the uterus and cohorts to show you this. So
These labs is wider that we know. And what you ask them is that they can rely on us. Rely on us. That's one way which goes to show. Hello, is that what can I do? Hey, read your mouth. Sure. Cloud services are designed for every business on the go. And so reliable.
Which eventually will become secondary hormones. What you have to realize is that this hormone, one, the levels mentally stable, doesn't fluctuate as much as the other ones. It is a marker